Ladies and gents, welcome to episode 119 of A Thompsin and Other Disappointments. We're back here, beer in hand, well, almost in hand. We're keeping it booge. We're keeping it hashtag binfluencer. If it's your first time listening, that's the vibe here. I do, a bit of online stuff. I'm on Twitter and TikTok and Instagram, and if you're curious, you can always find me at Aid Thompsin with an IN on the end. But absolutely not, categorically not an influencer. Not inspiring you. I'm not telling you to live your best life. It's more the opposite. I am what we call a binfluencer. And this is a binfluencers podcast where we scrape a handful of awful from the bottom of a bin, show it to you, oh, look at this shit, everything's fucked, and then tell you to grab a drink, sit down, and we'll try and get some doom lols out of it. That is the vibe, guys. Thanks very much to those of you who have jumped on the Patreon and continue to back the podcast. Every little bit helps, and we're looking to grow it week by week. If you're not in a position to support via Patreon, all I would ask is just take an episode that you've enjoyed and send it out to a mate. Help it to grow a little bit. More about that at the end of the show. And before we jump into tonight's episode proper, as it were, with tonight's guest, who I'm super psyched to be speaking with, I am equally psyched about the London meetup, which is happening on Thursday, the 27th of October in London E1. But yeah, as I say, more about the Patreon and that at the end of the show. My guest this week is a molecular immunologist at the University of Roehampton. Our paths crossed online, and veteran viewers on YouTube will perhaps know that I enjoy throwing questions at academics, at people infinitely smarter than me who can give me the answers that I'm looking for about life, love, the universe. And we had a bit of a brief exchange on a tweet thread. But then once I saw his bio, I thought, great, fucking perfect, bullseye. Because I don't know about you guys listening, but it feels like a weird time right now, I think. Like the pandemic hit. Everything changed, the world shifted, but now we're at this sort of weird purgatorial point where it's like, are we out of it? Is it over? Or am I being complacent? Am I being that guy where everyone's like, well, no, you got to be vigilant. We're not out of this yet. Am I being that guy? But more than that, this is a guy who has some experience in making sense of some of that, and also genome studies, and most importantly, an academic who, I'd love to hear his thoughts about anti-science, misinformation, and so on. So there's a lot that we can touch on with my guest tonight. So to that end, please welcome to the show, Dr. Robert Busch. Woo!
Hello and good evening.
Good evening to you.
That was quite an introduction. That's quite an act to live up to, and I shall do my best.
Sure.
So I'm in your hands, Aid, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, let's get into it. So I mentioned our paths crossed on Twitter. One of the things I wanted to talk to you tonight that I was alluding to a second ago was sort of misinformation, which obviously that just catches fire on Twitter and Facebook. I was curious to hear what your thoughts are about misinformation, specifically around the scientific community, because that must be a real bone of contention, a real frustration for you as a man of science, man of facts, stats, figures. Could you talk us through your experience of misinformation and how frustrating it's been for you?
It's a really interesting topic and a factor in the way that my own sort of work life has unfolded during the pandemic so far. And I'm not sure that I have any pithy statements about it. But it comes in all sorts of very interesting forms, and each one brings its own ways of thinking about pushing back as a scientist and as someone who's interested sort of as a citizen in living in a reality-based universe.
Sure.
And it comes up in our teaching as well. So so at Roehampton we do a good amount of teaching in our academic workday, and one of the things I do is look after groups of students who are in to study biomedical science, as in the sort of version of it where people go on and become lab scientists in the National Health Service. So that is what our degree course is accredited for. And this is actually one of the exercises that we get our first year students to do, to dig into a bit of misinformation, pseudoscience, anything of that ilk, and work out a scientifically based debunking. And it turns out not to be a very simple thing to do.
So could you give us maybe an example?
And first year students, if any of you will be listening, I have no idea, but this will be coming up in your course at some point fairly soon. That's just a little plug. But
could you maybe give us an example of
well, they get into all sorts of things. They get into homeopathy. They get into vaccine disinformation in COVID. They get into astrology, and the assignment is very broad. They can pick what they want and make something of it, but then they need to have a scientifically well-founded response to this and figure out whether they can dig up some relevant literature, which turns out to be an interesting challenge in its own right. So during COVID, there has been a lot of disinformation about the pandemic itself. Was it a thing? Was debated. Was it as severe as sort of official public health officials made it out to be? And the answer to that was yes, but that was hotly debated. There was an extraordinary amount of disinformation about vaccines and what they are and what they aren't, and whether they are even vaccines and what form they took. There was an awful lot about the science that genuinely shifted over the course of the pandemic, about other measures to reduce transmission. And a lot of the stuff in that space that was quite interesting to me was that some of the claims about what was efficacious and what wasn't, if you looked at the data, was on a grayscale. And what public pronouncements seemed to suggest was that it was black and white. And the counter arguments were about it being black and white in the opposite direction, when in fact everything was a shade of gray. So I'm talking about things like, at some point, I'm not quite sure whether it was Boris Johnson or one of his public health sidekicks, like Professor Whitty, who made statements about the safety of the vaccine and about the efficacy of the vaccine. And on the efficacy side, they were saying things like, the vaccine works against severe outcomes like hospitalization and death, but it doesn't stop you from catching it and transmitting it. And those things weren't wrong, but it was made out to be an all or none thing. Whereas it is still true that vaccinated people, albeit at much lower frequencies, will have to go to hospital and will unfortunately pass away. Although that is much less common, it's not down to zero. And on the other hand, at the early stages in the pandemic, there was a measurable and clear effect in reducing infection and transmission, but it was, but the effect again was not all or none, and it was weaker. It might have been sort of in the 30% to 50% range rather than in the 95% plus range.
So
but all of this was black and white, and in the discourse, whereas it was shades of grey in real life. And I think my own sort of temperament is more about shades of grey, maybe. And I thought that was an interesting thing to note. The same thing about the vaccines are safe and effective. Yes, you can argue that, but the effectiveness, of course, keeps changing in response to a variety of things. The next variant might have some escape, and the vaccines would be a little bit less effective. And that keeps carrying on. The memory that you build up, the immune memory that you build up from the vaccines, will peak at some point after you receive your jab and then fade again. And again, that is not a black and white thing. And
did it surprise you that
yes.
So what you're referring to there in terms of like the arena of misinformation is sort of around the nuances, right? So you've got you refer to it as sort of
yes.
black and white versus the grey area. But I suppose the problem, like that's where scientific debate comes in. But then the problem with that is then you've got this sort of realm of journalists who then use the grey area as a way of, I don't know if furthering an agenda is the right phrase in this instance.
It's very, very tricky,
doubt, right?
So this is very tricky because on the one hand, I think knowing a little bit about the shades of grey can inform behavior. So if you know that the vaccine only partially protects you from infection and transmission, you might then think about other measures to take that might also have a partial effect. But if you have several layers of protection, you sort of get a compound interest effect whereby your protection actually gets a lot better if more measures are adopted and if other people you interact with also adopt protective measures. So that kind of thing goes out of the window if you think about it as black and white, and then just say, well, mask, certain kinds of masks may not really work, and the vaccine doesn't really work, except it does to some extent, and every one of these measures adds a quantum of solace, perhaps not, but protection.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because, sorry to interrupt.
Collectively, take that mindset is different. Yes.
Yeah, I was just going to say it's interesting, isn't it? Because it's the same. I mean, I don't necessarily want to get too political in this hour that we spend together. But it's interesting that it tends to be the same people who would be dismissive of any issues with something like Brexit, like, Project Fear, no, it'll never happen, like that sort of thing. And then when you present them with something like masks or jabs, then it's not like, it'll be all right. It's more like, they'll never work. They don't do anything, It's like sort of the same dismissiveness, but just like inverted almost.
Well, so where's the common denominator? And we can go there, but I just wanted to go back and really speak to what you were alluding to earlier, which was that there's an advantage in thinking black and white, which is that it's the simplicity of the message and the way it cuts through. So if a GP tells you the vaccine is safe and effective, that's one thing. If I, as an academic, say, well, you have a very low but non-zero chance of having a severe side effect, but trade that off against the risk of an infection that is rampant around us and that has overall a higher likelihood, even when you're young, of doing something quite unpleasant to you, then that is a weaker message than the vaccine is safe and effective. Sure. And I understand that. And I think one of the things I've got to deal with this a little bit because I am actually involved in a little bit of an outreach program that has worked with the community in Roehampton, which is a part of southwest London that is underserved in terms of medical needs. And has a lot of interesting and wonderful diversity, but as a drawback to that, also some communities in which there's been a lot of spread of disinformation. And that was the really quite mad stuff. That was not rational concerns of the hesitant. That was, the full-on 5G, whatever that organization was that tried to peddle COVID, chloroquine and ivermectin, which all turned out to be, plausible leads that didn't pan out in the end. Yeah. And where if you knew how to interpret the studies, they were unconvincing at the beginning, and they got weaker as more data and better data became available.
Can I just ask? Did it surprise you? So I always imagined something like the anti-vax movement. When you say anti-vaxxers, I always imagined like red state America, like people in, I don't know, Mississippi, sort of chewing some tobacco. Like, not to sound too judgy about it, but it felt like a problem over in America, in maybe some of the less educated parts of America, or, it didn't feel like something that was going to come knocking on the door in the UK. Did it surprise you that it took hold?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I spent part of my working life in the United States, albeit in the blue states. I think almost invariably. I did do a cross-country trip at some point. And I've had interesting conversations with people of politically very different persuasions.
Sure.
But, okay, so am I surprised? Yes and no. I think one of the things that's been interesting to watch has been that and this goes back a little bit to what you were saying about the common denominators here. What is a common denominator between some strains of Brexitism and some strains of vaccine skepticism that are not founded in realistic fears?
I would say
issues. And I think one. Sorry, you were going to provide an answer. I was going to go on.
Sorry. You continue
attempt on myself.
Yeah.
But one thing that is interesting to me is that is about how people evaluate risk and benefit in a quantitative way. That's not necessarily a task that is easy to do if you don't have a little bit of training in it, and the general public doesn't really get that training. But the other thing is that we all fall victim to biases, I think. And one of them might be to say, well, you're either really interested in knowing what the constraints of a problem are, and then try to work your way through that maze to something that is a decent outcome. And you are trying to, work within a space that is given in this way, or you think primarily led by things like lofty principles. And and again, there's sort of an element of absolutist thinking in some strains, I think, of that I've seen in the Brexit debate. One of them is this sense that what you really want to avoid in relation to the EU is to avoid any compromise on national sovereignty. And I think that becomes very difficult when the basis for trade easements, for making things like Northern Ireland relations work without friction at the two borders that matter to that problem, when that really involves dealing with another entity that exists in the real world and that you can't wish away. And it seems to me that that in the question about how you deal with vaccines, again, how you deal with a pandemic, I should rather say.
Sure.
The problem is that none of us really want to deal with this, and some of the measures that need to be contemplated and possibly implemented are an encroachment on individual liberties. And so one option then is to say, okay, I'm going to, make an informed decision about this, about where on a spectrum from liberalism to authoritarianism it is appropriate for me to be based on the realities of the situation. Another one will say, well, give me liberty or give me death. And I think both extremes on that spectrum are hazardous. The extreme on the vaccine side would be to say, okay, you have extreme viral laissez-faire because you don't want to interfere in any way with the liberty of people to congregate
Yeah.
to be sociable, to assert their political will by going out on the street, and and you don't want any intrusion into people's lives, and then you have to live with the fact that that would, at the beginning of the pandemic, have caused an awful lot of deaths. And I think there's very little question about that. And one response to that could just be to dismiss that as a problem entirely, or to minimize it.
Mm.
The other end, at the other end of the spectrum, you might conceive of an approach that prioritizes preserving life over everything else, and then we would all still be locked up and only be talking on Skype or Zoom or Teams or whatever, and no one would ever would get to do some of the things that they value. And so in real life, even the most restrictive countries have navigated that territory and made shifting decisions. I think the UK ended up making almost perversely sort of very authoritarian decisions some of the time, and very libertarian decisions at other points in the pandemic. And both of them were ill-timed and not super productive at that time. And I think one of the things that as a sort of, when you observe the field, you see is that that some countries, specifically around the Pacific Rim, actually did really well initially out of testing and contact tracing. And in the UK, that was adopted, and it was much, much less effective, but a lot of that was about the implementation of that and the manner in which it was organized. And if you'd seen what the South Koreans were doing about that, it would have been, first of all, much more rigorous, and yes, also rather more intrusive, but also remarkably more effective at saving lives and leading to fewer restrictions in the country. But it was a really, really rigid system of border controls.
Why do you think we didn't do that?
There are different solutions to these problems, but there is a meaningful difference between solving these problems with a regard to the external realities of it and trying to navigate those, rather than going on lofty principle and being prone to erring on one extreme or the other and getting it quite catastrophically wrong.
Why do you think we didn't ape the South Korean approach and the New Zealand approach? Do you think it was as black and white as Boris Johnson is, or likes to think he's a libertarian and he doesn't want to encroach on people's freedoms? Or do you think it was media pressure, or a mix of both, or are we just useless?
I think it might not be good for my blood pressure to read the Right Honourable Boris Johnson's mind. However, if you put me on the spot about this, what would I say? Now, so I think it was around February, he gave a major speech, I forget exactly in which international forum, in which he took pride in saying, well, we are not going to shut down the country or impose border controls because we want to set a deliberate counterweight to the idea that the response to this is shutting things down. And it was, I think, partly a desire in the aftermath of the end of the Brexit transition to demonstrate there and then that Britain was open for business. And politically, maybe that was understandable at that time for him. And perhaps also in terms of his general attitude, which is perhaps, somewhere on the laissez-faire libertarian end of the spectrum, I think, in terms of some of the attitudes that he was transporting at the time.
I love that like laissez-faire libertarianism, where it's like you're very much up for people's freedoms, but mostly because you just can't be asked.
Well, and the neglect ends up having a little bit of a sting in the tail, because then weeks later it became apparent that the cost of that would be overwhelming the National Health Service. And what had become apparent in the meantime was that that regions in Italy, in northern Italy, specifically, I seem to remember the city of Bergamo, had really severe problems, not because they didn't want to act promptly, but because they were actually blindsided by the speed with which tourism from China had imported the virus.
Yeah.
And those places became ghost towns. Hospitals became completely overwhelmed. And so in the UK, it became apparent that to avert a similar scale of the problem, there then had to be a very aggressive shutdown. And at that point, we were all locked in our homes with only an hour or two to go out every day. And that was very burdensome on people's mental health. And some of those decisions probably were helpful and did avert bad things. Other bad things nonetheless happened. Introducing infections into the care homes, I think, was a complete disaster and a real horror show for the people who went through that. Anyway, so the pendulum swung in both ways, but there was really no upfront consistency in the strategy that was adopted. And I think the Pacific Rim had a slightly different model for dealing with this, because they looked at this and said, oh, it's a coronavirus. That is reminiscent of SARS and MERS.
Yeah.
Now, those are also coronavirus diseases, but their pattern of spread was different. But it turns out that taking that approach ended up working in the pre-vaccine era to really clamp down on the spread of the infection in the countries that took this coronavirus as seriously as SARS and MERS, which are more severe on the individual, but actually less transmissible. And so they contact traced the heck out of this. There was a famous case study of, I think, an evangelical church that ended up actually being sort of a super spreader, causing a super spreader event with some, 1,000 or so people infected by one person walking into their church and spreading it. And the amazing thing is that they actually did hunt down those cases.
Yeah.
And stop the further spread of the infection from there on out. In the UK, I think there was never any chance, because the guiding model for the pandemic response was to treat it as a respiratory pandemic that was influenza-like. And of course, there is merit to the comparison because it spreads through the respiratory tract. What they didn't bargain for was that it was more transmissible, and also, once you had the infection, more likely to do you severe harm. And that was just the acute harm that was long before we knew about long COVID, vascular complications, long-term changes in the risk of immune complications or clotting-related illnesses, which are now coming to light gradually. So we now know that there is a long-term legacy of being infected, which will affect possibly not everyone, but some sizable enough proportion. And now that the risk of infection is so widespread, and the virus is as rampant as it has been allowed to become, there may well be long-term issues with healthcare provision, because all of those longer-term consequences haven't really been factored in and will now need to be mopped up by the NHS somehow.
Yeah. And so, like, where are we at the moment then in terms of the pandemic? I mean, we've talked about misinformation, and we've talked about some of the challenges and troubles and different approaches that were rolled out in the earlier periods therein.
Yes.
Where, like, it's difficult to work out at the moment if we should still be in panic mode, or if everything's gone back to normal, or, if I go into Pret now, nobody's wearing masks anymore, even like on trains or anything, and it's off the front pages, like everyone's talking about the pound crashing, or what's going to happen to the NHS this winter, like with, I suppose that's, COVID related ish, but what's your opinion? Where are we at with the pandemic?
Right. So I don't think I would ever be someone to advocate for panic. But I do think that there is a method to the madness that seems to have been adopted by, the political communicators about this, and by the media, because. And I think this goes into perhaps a more subtle strain of disinformation, which is just not providing the information.
Right. Just like
so
blackout.
that's is an interesting one, and I don't think it's a formal blackout in any way. But of course, news is not news if you've been living with this stuff for a few years, right?
Right.
It becomes tedious, and it probably becomes tedious to report about. I think it's, if you're under pressure to make a success of a big transformational project like Brexit, for better or worse, and if you are under pressure at the moment to show that you're all about growth,
right.
sort of looking at the latest discourse, what you really don't want is to be dragged down by people limiting their consumption or altering their behavior to respond to an ongoing infectious illness that has remained at high levels.
So it is still at high levels.
If I wanted, sorry.
So it is still at high levels, So the short answer to that is undoubtedly yes. Right, that's interesting.
So if you and that's interesting to me, that is news. But that's precisely because of the extent to which there hasn't been constant reinforcement in recent months, ever since pretty much, I think, was it Nadhim Zahawi who became health minister at some point under Johnson? And at that point, basically, he said, OK, we're going to lift all the restrictions and it's over. And we're no longer going to publish. And I think that was the first interesting change in the reporting on it. We're not going to report anymore the daily statistics of infections and deaths. Mm. Which to me was an interesting decision.
Still because not a blackout, just to be clear.
No. I mean, I'm not saying that there's any censorship or anything overt like this. It's just we are not going to put that out anymore. There is, there was a government dashboard.
It is kind of in that neighbourhood, though, isn't it? Well, I mean, if you're saying I'm not going to publish the figures of how many people are dying per day of COVID, and we're lifting all the restrictions, it's like you're sort of removing the ability of journalists to scrutinise the government's approach and to warn people, and
Yeah. Well, so I mean, certainly experts in the field continue to monitor it, and so there are. If people want to follow this, by the way, so since we are also speaking to the public once this thing has been edited and gone out, so one place where you get pretty much weekly updates is on the YouTube channel of Tim Spector's and colleagues Zoe app. So this is a study to which millions of people in the UK have signed up, basically to log respiratory symptoms, and it's now broadened a little bit, but that's an aside. But recording positive tests, recording their vaccine status, and recording respiratory, flu-like, and COVID symptoms. And from that comes a very closely monitored natural history of the illness through time, through geography, and also some breakdown according to demographics. So at the moment, for example, we find, so all of this year, we've had levels of transmission and infection at levels that have at least been comparable to, if not exceeded, the earlier waves.
Wow!
And if that comes as a shock, then okay, take a look at the Zoe app and take a look at that. And they have a website as well.
Like that. How weird is it that? So we're all familiar with the what is it, 200,000 deaths figure, and most people know about the social care homes debacle. But it's almost as much of a scandal to be at this stage of the pandemic where as many people are dying as in the earlier waves, or did you say as many cases?
No, sorry, this was about, so just to be clear about this is about cases.
Right.
So the Zoe COVID app tracks cases.
Sure, my mistake.
That's so, and it is, I think it is true that ever since the advent of the vaccines, there has been a partial uncoupling so that we can now sustain much higher caseloads without having nearly the same level of deaths and hospitalizations. But they're not down to zero.
Sure.
And and so
Is there
I should have looked up before we met where the best place is that you can now get death statistics, and I think it's probably the updates by the Office of National Statistics, which looks at where COVID comes on the death certificate. Now, those tend to lag behind what used to be the daily death reports, which were just death within 28 days of a positive test. And the objection to that more recently was that post-vaccination, there were plenty of people who had COVID on board because it was circulating in a hospital, but they died of other causes.
Sure.
And so that's not necessarily the best metric. But back to sort of infection and how likely you are to be exposed in your everyday life. That goes. The other source of information is that every 2 weeks there is a national survey, which I think is by the Health Security Agency, and that's basically a survey with random sampling of tens of thousands of people across the UK to determine, using PCR testing, what is the rate at which you're likely to encounter COVID in the general population.
Right.
And so those efforts are continuing, and it took quite a bit of pushing on the part of the scientists to get Zahawi to continue those, but they are much less reported. Anyway, so at several points in this past year, we've been at sort of infection rates according to both of those studies, the Zoe app and the national surveillance study every 2 years, where you're anywhere between 1 in 50 and 1 in 20 people in the population being infected at any one time.
Yeah.
And so if you think about how rapidly this stuff spreads around, then that is one heck of a lot of cases, cumulative.
Yeah, I mean, it helps, I think, if you think of it like, okay, look, I go into London every Thursday. I'm going to be on a train, and that train is going to have at least 15 to 20 people in my carriage. So my chances of catching COVID every time.
Exactly.
I'm not just on
going
one train.
into a supermarket. Yes, or going into a supermarket or going into any crowded setting. So we just had the start of teaching in the university term, and the first thing I walk into is a tutor group of 15 people, and one of them has cold symptoms. Now the Zoe app actually now also tracks the common cold because they're hard to differentiate from COVID. And according to people being willing to get tested on demand when they develop respiratory symptoms, this is one of the things you sign up for when you do the app study. I think at the moment you get sort of about 3 cases of non-COVID common colds to 1 case of COVID. And because schools are open and universities are open, the younger age groups are driving the transmission and are passing it up through the different age groups. And one of my colleagues on our technical team has just recovered from her 3rd bout of reinfection. And so that was the other hope, I think, that ended up being, I think, both a misconception at the beginning and something that was suggested by scientists as a way out of the pandemic, and then later turned out to be a little bit of a misunderstanding of the science, I think, which is the idea of herd immunity.
Sure.
That we would build up immunity over time through natural infection, which is really a misapplication of the concept of herd immunity.
Doesn't it go back to like the nature of it being a coronavirus as well? Like this idea that you could like catch a cold and then be immune to colds is sort of fantasy, right? So if this is a coronavirus also, then surely that would be out the window from day zero.
So what you're alluding to is the fact that there are common cold coronaviruses. I seem to remember that there are like 4 different major strains of those, and they circulate in the way that common cold does. They are not as pernicious in terms of the risk of severe outcomes or long-term complications as COVID has unfortunately turned out to be. But yes, reinfection with those is possible, and immunity to them is not going to be stable enough over time to protect you in the long term. But of course, that is those are only 4 strains of virus, and there are hundreds of viruses of other types that can give you common cold symptoms and that are spread through your breathing apparatus in various permutations. So one of the reasons why the common cold has been so challenging has been that actually it's just an awful lot of viruses, and there will always be one that your immune system can't deal with terribly well, and then you've got the next one.
I read somewhere that the Spanish flu had, as it had worked its way around, it had become milder, and actually they can still, maybe I'm butchering the quote here, but I'm sure I remember reading this, that they can detect traces of the Spanish flu in the colds and flus and whatever that are going around today, but now they're obviously a lot milder. Is that your understanding also? Okay,
so this is an interesting one. And again, sort of for historical background, so the Spanish flu was not really Spanish. Right. It arose in 1918, and I believe that it was traced back to the United States, and it came into Europe through troop ships at the end of World War One, and it was in Spain where the first severe outbreaks happened in garrison settings, spread like wildfire, and it was a particularly nasty strain of influenza. One of the things about influenza that coronavirus happily doesn't do is it has a genetic makeup where the genes come in chunks, just like humans have chromosomes, but much smaller.
Right.
And so what can happen is that if you have a single cell in a host, and this is often an animal host, that gets infected by 2 strains of flu virus, it reshuffles those segments and comes out as a completely novel thing. Right. This is called antigenic shift. And that's something that influenza can do that coronavirus, to our knowledge, doesn't do, which is sort of wholesale reshuffling events like that create completely new strains. So this was one against which humans so the human species had never encountered it before, and that's how you get an influenza pandemic, because no one then has enough immunity, and as a result, that was a very severe illness. It killed preferentially people sort of in their prime, and so it was devastating in military settings, and of course the whole world was in a world war, and so there were a lot of those, and that's how that ended up being incredibly lethal, and in particular in young adults.
And is it still detectable today, though?
It is true that influenza doesn't really go away, and it keeps mutating at a slow clip, and we have several independently several strains of influenza viruses that make their way around the globe in a normal year, sort of, in an annual cycle, often coming out of various new variants coming out of various regions in Eastern Asia, and they make their way around the globe, and they are distinct enough from previous ones that maybe 1 in 5 of the population has no previous immunity. Or not enough, not enough previous immunity from previous bouts of encounter with similar viruses. And so the virus, those viruses overall can propagate themselves, and they keep varying their structure and gradually getting away from the immune response. And that's where you get seasonal flu. It happens to hit in Europe in the winter months. And that's, of course, also a place where a time in the year when people gather indoors and can spread the illness, which doesn't help. So overall, seasonal influenza is less harmful for a variety of reasons. The 1918 influenza actually was able not just to get into the lungs, but spread throughout the body.
Right.
That's one big way in which viruses can cause extra trouble, because that means that the inflammation that is part of the immune system's response to controlling the virus then happens all over the body, and systemic inflammation is bad news for our own organism, because all of these defensive reactions can be harmful to normal tissues in our body as well. It's called immune pathology. But the seasonal strains of influenza just vary a little bit year on year. They don't do a grand reshuffling. They have a little bit of variation from one year to the next, to the point where you'll have some people who don't have enough immunity to just nip it in the bud. Okay. And those are the ones who then transmit it. And if you're looking at, you will have, during the pandemic, everyone heard about R numbers for COVID, and that virus had an R number of 3 to begin with, and then several of the variants became more and more transmissible. For influenza, seasonal influenza has an R value of around 1.3.
Okay.
So, and of course now everything is different, because and you can't really speak of sort of a basic R number, because we all have partial immunity, and the concept doesn't apply in quite the same way.
So as the Spanish flu, or United States flu, that then migrated to
it's called this. I mean, by all means, call it the Spanish flu. It is how it is known.
So as the Spanish flu mutated or adapted and evolved, and it became less deadly, is that like there was a lot being talked about around this in the mid sort of throes of the pandemic, was that it will probably mutate, and that you'll get variants and subvariants, and eventually it will just sort of wind its way down to being a nasty cold. Is that accurate, or was that disinformation as well? Or
I think so. I think there are common thoughts about this, and one of them is that in general, a virus doesn't care to kill you.
As in, it doesn't want to kill you, or it doesn't care if
it has no intent.
Sure.
And also depending on how good it is at killing you, getting better and better at killing you may not be the best strategy for the virus.
Yeah.
So the only thing that the virus can, in any meaningful sense, be said to care about, and of course it's not conscious. It's a bit of genetic bad news wrapped in some lipids and proteins. To paraphrase a common description of a virus, the only thing that ensures its survival is the ability to replicate and to move from one unwilling host to another. And so
is it in the virus's interest?
If you have a virus that is so nasty that, first of all, it lays you down only after you develop symptoms, and then so severely that you're going to just be isolated anyway because you're not wandering around because you're too ill, then then the virus might be terrible for you, but it's not going to be terrible to humans in general for very long, because it's not going to spread very far. So there have been outbreaks of Ebola that have been fairly self-limiting because people got too ill to be effective transmitters.
That's a really interesting point to make, actually.
And SARS it was never terribly good at transmitting from human to human, and part of that was because it caused symptoms relatively early on in the course of being infectious.
Yeah.
So what is interesting about COVID is, first of all, on the spectrum of things like Ebola or SARS or MERS to seasonal flu, it is more lethal than we would like it to be. No one likes a virus to have any death rate, but it is not that lethal. And so becoming less lethal is not necessarily going to help it spread any better. And the other thing is that we know that it can spread before it causes any symptoms, if it ever does. So there are asymptomatic spreaders, and there are people who are infectious before they develop symptoms themselves.
So just to sort of play that back to you. So it is not in the virus's interest to lay you out where you're not then interacting with other people, where it could make that leap from
Yes.
person A to person B.
Yes.
So in some instances, viruses might mutate to become a little bit more mild, so that then you are still able to go around and the virus can continue to jump and grow
Yes.
amongst the population. However, with COVID, you're saying because it's now mutated and we've got variants and subvariants, and it's at a state where you can pass it on amongst the crowd, amongst the people within the train, before it's really laid you out, it has no real incentive. Like, the virus doesn't necessarily care if you get laid out sort of in 3-4 days, because by that point it's already been spread to another 3 or 4 or 5 people.
Yes, that's fair. Yeah, cool. That's that. I think you got that exactly right. So basically, for the virus, there's little mileage in becoming less lethal, and it is already able to spread asymptomatically. And on top of that, through evolving variants, it seems to have got better at that. So if you're looking at the progression of the main variants that were circulating in the UK, it went in a way that any classical scholar will dislike. It went from alpha to delta to omicron.
Yeah.
If you're and each of those was a gain in the ability to transmit compared to the original strain that we imported originally from China, but via various European states where it had already begun to mutate a little bit.
Is it? Can I just ask?
So it's become it had become more transmissible, and in the first major variants, it seems to have become more virulent. So people without vaccine immunity or without natural immunity could get infected, and the risk of bad outcomes like hospitalization and deaths, like for like, seem to be getting worse for alpha and for delta. It seems to have got a little bit better, all things considered, for Omicron, but Omicron had the ability to reinfect people who had previously survived and weathered a bout of alpha or delta.
Yeah.
And now we are dealing with subvariants of Omicron, but basically the virus seems to have become more and more transmissible, but not always was that by becoming more benign.
Sure. No, that's
Omicron does seem to have gone in that direction, but I think the jury is out about what further potential there is for mutations.
Yeah.
I mean, there is one strain of thought which basically says eventually the virus will run out of novel ways of mutating, and they will then sort of be in a space where some people will always, have lost enough immunity to get reinfected eventually, but there's not. But you're going to sort of just have a cloud of variants that can all sort of circulate well enough, but you've sort of exhausted the possibilities that exist for it. But I think that's very much hand waving. I don't think I would feel comfortable, and I'm not enough of a virologist really to speculate now about how the sort of the interplay of immunity and viral variation and the ability of the virus to get around the defenses of the immune system is going to evolve in 10 years' time. But this whole overall trend towards becoming benign, that's a very rough rule. And I think if that applies at all, it'll only apply over the very long term. I don't think that it's necessarily a rule that's useful for prediction in the short term.
Right. That's interesting, because it's sort of, it almost, I'm using slightly dramatic language here, but it sort of condemns us to living with COVID, right? And that we just have to begrudgingly accept that 400 people a week are going to die from it.
This is clearly psychologically very, very difficult. So, and this is one of the places where you do see sort of all the strands of the discussion on Twitter, since you and I both met there.
Sure.
And it's interesting because, and again, if if you're saying, well, no one in politics and very few people in the media are interested in saying, well, you know what, it's another Monday and COVID's still around, and be careful. Okay, it just gets very, very boring, and I get that. I still try when I go into lectures where statistically there will be someone spreading something like this. I still wear a mask, and now that we're dealing with Omicron, it's clear that the surgical masks are not good enough anymore, and so I do invest in FFP2 grade, and it never makes quite the perfect fit around your face, but it's going to be better than having something that flaps in the wind and allows virus particles to come through. Surgical masks are really good against droplets, but not against aerosols that are smaller, that just float in the air, and that seems to be how COVID seems to spread. But I know that, of course, in lecture theatres, students in the UK are painfully polite, and they will not criticize you for it. But if I go into other group settings in my social life, sometimes I get to enjoy that. I think you and I talked about the fact that I sing in choirs.
Sure.
And I still wear a mask in choir settings because, for one thing, I don't want to be a source of infection to other people who, on average, are older and sometimes maybe clinically more vulnerable for various reasons, and I don't want to give it to them. But I get A, funny looks, B, occasionally pointed remarks about, oh, are you still wearing this thing?
Yeah.
I have had people who are more vulnerable than me walking in and sitting with neighbors and having cold symptoms, and they just say, I just have a cold. Do you know that could be COVID? Oh. And then days later, I find that half a dozen people sitting around the same person got infected.
Yeah.
So I think there's a reluctance to continue to adapt to this. And I think it's partly, very understandably, because it was very burdensome. It was just a really rough time, especially the period when we were physically isolated from friends and loved ones. And it was a horror. It was a particular horror in care homes where they still didn't get the protection from it. But I think it was difficult for all of us.
But is it also like you mentioned, sort of psychologically, it's a difficult thing to take on board, and I agree. I think it's there's this. If you try to explain to someone that the world has changed, that we have this virus, we're gonna have to live with it, and part of living with it is actually being an adult and accepting that you yourself could be infectious and that other people around you could be infectious, and we're all just gonna have to play nicely and think of others a little bit more. But I think for a lot of people, they're like, fingers in ears, la la la, I don't want to have to accept that the world has changed. I want things back to the same way that they were before. I don't want to have to wear this mask. It's for some people, that's a harder thing to take on the shoulders, isn't it?
And perhaps there's something positive about it, which is, I'm not going, for in some people's minds, the risk assessment might be, look, yes, I know I'm taking a risk. And I prefer living with that risk and being a bit freer with my social interactions and so on, and that freedom is worth that risk for me. And I think if people make a conscious choice like that, there's still a question about how those choices affect others when it might not be you, but someone 3 rounds of transmission away from you who gets it so badly that they die. So I think there's still an ethical question there, which might be rude to bring up in polite conversation. But I think that it's certainly something that is on my mind when I'm trying to take steps that protect not just me from others, but also others from me. And if anything, mask wearing has a reasonable chance of protecting others from my effusions. If I happen to carry the virus, whether I know it or not.
Sure. Dr. Robert, we've been talking for an hour. It's flown by. Everything that you've been saying has been so interesting. I've just been, lapping it up. But I wondered if I could just ask you one more question. And I've asked this of a few guests that have come on, particularly or usually academics, because I'm of the sort of persuasion and sensibility where I have very little faith and hope left in the state of the world. I think if a nuclear war doesn't happen, then climate change is going to render the planet uninhabitable. And if that doesn't happen, the oil's going to run out and chaos will ensue. Where do you sit on the, I have faith or I have no faith kind of scale? Where do you think we're headed?
Okay. Well, I think one segue from what we've been talking about to this topic is this. If you're looking at the science around climate change, it's very clear that the way to minimize further harm, further overstretching the carrying capacity of the planet is for us individually and collectively to act on a scale that is difficult to contemplate, and really to prioritize making things not worse for future generations and indeed for our later lives, because the damage from climate change is already visible and very clear. And it's only one of a bunch of tipping points about how we're overstretching the planet. So one of the consequences of the way that humans encroach on the rest of the biosphere is that we're creating increasing opportunities for animal pathogens, for viruses in particular, to jump species to humans. And this is whether this is indirect through a lab leak or through the wet markets in Wuhan doesn't really particularly matter. That's perhaps an interesting discussion for another day. But this is one of the consequences of how humans are changing the planet in the big picture. It is, for want of a better word, our fault. In response to this particular emerging virus that has turned into a pandemic, we have signally failed to live up to the challenge of containing it and making it go away. We are now faced with the question of the extent to which we let it run and run its course, the extent to which we persist in acting on it, and we're going to find a trajectory, but it seems to err on the side of, the closer to business as usual we get, the more comfortable we're going to feel. But with that comes an increased burden of unpleasantness, of long COVID, of an increased risk of cardiovascular incidents that might happen, maybe a year on out. So there are interesting early studies that suggest that after COVID, you have an increased risk, at least for a while, of getting heart attacks and the like. There are people who end up severely compromised in their ability to function because of something that their immune system or their vascular system has done in response to the initial infection. And there's a lot of interesting research about that. But the upshot of all of that is we are living with a lot of consequences of the fact that we haven't actually grasped the nettle. We haven't actually looked the problem square in the eye and acted in such a way as to nip it in the bud. And now it's with us. So if that happens with sort of one of them, if anything, sort of this is a minor, mild side effect of climate change in that bigger picture, or in the picture of human encroachment on the carrying capacity of the planet. This is minor. So if in response to the minor challenge, we're saying, it's fine, we're going to just muddle through. I sort of very much see the same thing happening with climate change. We are not really changing our behavior in regard to where we source our energy, how we consume it, and how we act collectively to defossilize our energy supply. And indeed, we have a little bit of a human conflict. It's obviously a huge one in Ukraine, but on a global scale, it's a regional conflict, and the gas markets explode, and we realize just how dependent we still are on this stuff. So we haven't really acted we haven't looked that problem squarely in the eye, and that in the end is going to be the grandmother of challenges for us. So I think. I believe you like to have a dystopia warning in your podcasts, and I think in the end, it's interesting how we are being led by our tendency to prefer not changing, to prefer business as usual. Into a situation that is probably rather less pleasant than it might otherwise have been if we had actually said, here's a problem, here's the shape of what we need to navigate, let's find a better path than just letting it roll over us. And we've done some things, okay? So influenza is being kept at bay partly by vaccination, partly by a behind-the-scenes effort at monitoring variants and adapting vaccines. There's a huge public health effort that no one gets to see because people think seasonal flu is just seasonal flu and it happens anyway. Hospitals, the NHS has to adapt every winter to it, and now we have COVID on top. And the idea of letting a new illness sort of play itself out without any mitigation is going to come with costs. So yes, there is an interface there between science and politics, but I think better solutions to our collective problems come from understanding the problem and looking it squarely in the eye, and then saying, well, what is our best path? And my take on it is generally the best path is not just to let it run its course. The best path happens when humans use their ingenuity to find better solutions.
Dark. When we
because there's hope in it, because we are capable of the ingenuity. We are capable of innovation.
I agree. I mean,
but there is that question of human sluggishness, isn't there?
Yeah.
And that's tricky.
It's the sort of short-termist versus the long-termist view. So I'm imagining that you and I would agree that the future, energy-wise, let's focus on the fossil fuel nightmare first of all. That we could put nuclear power stations, about 4 or 5 of them around the country. We could invest heavily in solar and wind. We could probably find a way to, if not entirely power the UK by renewables, then at least a fairly healthy chunk of it, and make it, inch towards self-sustainability. But that is a long-term goal, trying to fix a long-term problem. And I feel like in the UK, and to be fair, other countries also, like the US, I'm sure, arguably has this, they're governed by, 4 or 5 year parliamentary or presidential terms. People want to get a quick win in, or a quick jab, cause a scandal, kick the government out, get your government in. And so where a country, let's say like China, and Russia, I guess, where they don't necessarily have to worry about 4 or 5 year presidential terms for, obvious reasons. They can look at the future in a sort of 10, 20, 30 year kind of strategy way. But over here, and because the West, I was about to say because the West run the world, because the West at least half the world, and they're governed by this sort of short-termist political strategy, my faith remains on the floor. I'm a bit like, I just don't see. I think some smart people will step forward and go, this is what we need to do if we really want to take climate change and fossil fuels seriously and fix these problems. And then the second that person says that, somebody else will step forward and go like, whoa, no, he's lying to you, and here's some disinformation, and now get my guys in, and it'll just be... That's, I don't know. That's my take.
So I think, you're raising some interesting questions, but I think on recent form, the authoritarian regimes that you've mentioned don't really have a track track record that says, well, just because we have the luxury of being able to think long term because we don't have to deal with divergent public opinion in the same way, it doesn't mean that they've in practice really done that much, done anything more. Russia has its own resource curse. It's a fossil fuel producer. And if anything, it uses its prowess at doing that to blackmail Europe with turning off the gas supply.
Yeah.
China has made some really interesting strides in terms of solar technology and renewables on the one hand, but on the other hand has also built coal-fired power plants at a rate that completely swamps out the scope for us to build wind farms against it. So I don't think that authoritarianism is necessarily the solution.
Oh, sure. No.
Unless you have the exceptional, very, very enlightened dictator who is sort of Platonic philosopher king. But that's the thing. People with absolute power have tended not to have that sort of mindset.
I mean, that's my ultimate goal for this.
And in the West, what is ironic is we've had, in some major Western countries, we've had some long-term leaders. We had Merkel in Germany, whose Energiewende has been entirely counterproductive, I'm afraid to say, much though I respect some of the other things that she managed to do. And in this country, we've had a dozen or so years under a government that was ostensibly led by the same party. But again, they've sort of applied the wrong recipes at the wrong time in the economic sphere and never really had the capacity to build a lasting solution that would increase the energy resilience in this country. So, where that leaves us, I'm not sure that there's a particular form of government that is decisive here so much as, again, sharing enough of a common ground of mutually accepted facts on which some things can be isolated from the political back and forth for the common good. And I don't have a recipe for that, but it's an interesting challenge.
If I were to ask you, on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being absolutely fucked and 1, well, I was going to say 0, 1. Well, 0 or 1 being, no, I think we're going to be fine. Where do you think?
Sunny uplands.
Yeah.
Well, I think I can respond. I can respond with with I think an economist's quip, which is that in the long run we're all dead. Yeah. No, but I tend towards the higher numbers, I'm afraid. So in that sense, I'm with you. What I would say is that I think there is a bit of wiggle room about how high the number can be, and there is sort of, there is the dreg of hope that refuses to die, that says, well, maybe we can, if we can all work to turn the dial down by a digit or two in our, with whatever action we can take in our own lives and with the way that we can work with others, then maybe that leaves us with enough hope to carry on. And I think that's a worthwhile aspiration, even though it seems like a small one. I think it's one of the biggest ones you can, which is to say, well, where is the wiggle room in your lives to make things better? Sure. And that can come in all sorts of interesting ways, sure, and unexpectedly sometimes.
Dr. Robert Busch, we are out of time, but thank you so much for joining me tonight. It's been really interesting.
Indeed. We haven't even talked, what is interesting here is we haven't even touched on anything related to my actual research. And really we haven't we've talked a lot more about COVID than we have about the immune system.
Yeah.
But anyway, so maybe there's going to be a future episode, but in the meantime, it's been a really interesting conversation for me as well. So thank you. And I hope that I've been coherent enough to be editable so that when the podcast goes out, it'll be of some interest to people. So thank you very much.
Yeah, you're very
welcome.
For having me. Thank you. Yeah, and I'd love to have you on again sometime, and we can talk about your studies and your area of expertise. I think we got into some really interesting stuff though about COVID and disinformation and indeed incoming dystopia. If you would like to follow Dr. Robert Busch, you can Google him and get to his Twitter that way. What's your actual handle on Twitter, Doctor?
It's Robert Busch 65. I'm thinking there might be an underline somewhere in there. But that will be one way of finding me. And of course, in my work capacity, there are web pages in the University of Roehampton if you want to dig into my research. But this has been very much this conversation has ended up being a little bit more like my Twitter persona, which does touch on a wider range of topics than my research specialty, it has to be said.
Cool. Yeah.
Right. So yes.
Cool. Well, yeah. Thank you again for joining us. A little bit of information on the podcast for anyone that's interested. So I do run a Patreon. So if you're enjoying a few different episodes of the podcast, then maybe consider jumping on that. It's patreon.com/Aid Thompson with an IN on the end. There's 3 tiers that you can jump on. The cheapest one is just £3 a month, which is just enough to really, it's a doff of the cap. To me, it's a doff of the cap and a thanks aid. I'm enjoying the show, and then I can spend that on a beer, which I may or may not drink in the middle of the show. There's some other tiers on there as well, and they get you a range of different benefits. And they move from like the London meetup, which we've got coming up on Thursday the 27th of October, so just a couple of weeks away. That's in East London. We've got a Discord channel where we talk about politics and share memes and all of that stuff. We've got an RSS feed where I'm posting each of these podcast episodes 2 days earlier to Patreon backers, and you can get that on subscription immediately to your podcast player. So there's a lot to look at. Oh, and the God tier, the golden tier, if you like, the elite tier is I think it's £10 a month, which is frankly ridiculous. But if you really love the show, you could jump on that. And if you join the £10 tier, people, then I'm going to do a monthly Skype call where the £10 people can jump on with me, and we can talk about anything you like. You can ask me about politics, life, love, the universe, whatever. If you're not in a position to support via Patreon, that is totally understandable. It is a weird time for everyone financially. As I said at the beginning, though, if you're enjoying the show, maybe just share me about. Just copy the link to an episode that you've enjoyed, pop into WhatsApp or Signal or whatever you're using, and send it to a mate and just say, I found this podcast, and it might be something that you're into. You might find it interesting also. Or something along those lines. You can be creative. I don't mind. Thank you once again to my guest tonight, Dr. Robert Busch. I'll be back on Wednesday with the solo show, and then next Friday night with another guest. So thank you once again. Goodbye. We outie.